A fresh warning from Washington as it considers further sanctions on Venezuela. The U.S. says it holds President Nicolas Maduro personally responsible for the safety of 2 opposition leaders jailed on Tuesday. The White House said it condemned the actions of the Maduro dictatorship and called for the immediate and unconditional release of all political prisoners, including Leopoldo Lopez and Antonio Ledesma. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights also weighed in from Geneva.
There are many reports that excessive force has been used in the context of demonstrations. We also have reports that they have conducted house-to-house raids and taken people and detained them. We are calling on the government to refrain from taking any further steps to make an already bad situation even worse.
CCTV footage and amateur video appeared to show intelligence services raiding the homes of Lopez and Ledesma in the middle of the night. Both men had called on Venezuelans to boycott Sunday's election of a special assembly with power to rewrite the constitution. They're believed to have been taken to a military jail.
The Brazilian president faces a crucial ballot in parliament on whether he should stand trial on corruption charges. Experts say Michel Temer is expected to scrape together enough votes in the unprecedented motion on Wednesday in the lower house of the country's Congress. Opponents of the president need 2/3 of the votes to approve charges against Temer and send the case to the Supreme Court. But even some of the president's adversaries acknowledge they don't have the numbers. Temer's been fighting for his political survival after allegations arose that he took bribes from big business. The scandal has all but paralyzed his government at a time when important budget legislation is needed to tackle the country's recession. Brazil has impeached 2 presidents, including Temer's predecessor Dilma Rousseff last year, but none has ever faced a congressional vote for a corruption trial.
The U.S. Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, says America does not seek to topple the North Korean government and would like dialogue with Pyongyang, but only with the understanding that it could never be a nuclear power.
Well, good afternoon, all. And we're trying to convey to the North Koreans, we are not your enemy, we're not your threat, but you are presenting an unacceptable threat to us, and we have to respond. And we hope that at some point they will begin to understand that.
Look at President Trump.
White House Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders faced questions from the U.S. media about Donald Trump's stance on North Korea.
Look, the president obviously has been very outspoken about how he feels about North Korea. We're weighing all options, keeping all options on the table. And as we've said many times before, we're not going to broadcast what we're going to do until that happens.
These developments come just days after South Korea and the United States held a joint military exercise in South Korea, just 15 miles from the North Korean border.
German car makers are meeting the government today, seeking solutions for the diesel sector damaged by scandals over emissions test cheating. The aim is to find ways to cut emissions and head off moves by some large cities to ban diesel vehicles. The government's been accused of not doing enough to crack down on pollution. Executives from all the main German car makers, as well as Ford, are taking part in the National Forum in Berlin, almost 2 years after the scandal broke over Volkswagen's diesel emissions. Ministers are wary of damaging an industry that's a major source of export income and provides around 800,000 jobs. Sources have said car makers will probably be spared making costly hardware changes to engines and instead may be asked to carry out software updates to around 2 million vehicles. In recent years, car makers have invested heavily in diesel technology, counting on it to help meet rules on lowering carbon dioxide emissions. But an estimated 15 million diesel cars on Germany's roads contribute around 40% to nitrogen oxide pollution in major cities, according to one environmental lobby group. It achieved victory last week when a court in Stuttgart said driving restrictions were justified, paving the way for the city described as the cradle of Germany's car industry to ban diesel cars from its streets.
Oh.
More than 1 million malnourished young children in Yemen are at risk of cholera. The warning comes from the charity Save the Children, which is sending more health experts there. The epidemic has already killed close to 2,000 people, and the UN says nearly 80% of Yemeni children need urgent humanitarian assistance.
Yemen's children are trapped in an almost unimaginable tragedy. They're under attack from all sides. Children are hugely malnourished all across the country, millions of children too weak to stand up, too weak to go to school, dying of hunger. A cholera epidemic that's also claiming the lives of children and their families.
The war between Houthi rebels and Saudi-backed forces has saddled this poor Arab country with a major health crisis.
Forces fighting on the ground bear some responsibility because they make it much harder for us to deliver humanitarian aid. But also the airstrikes by the Saudi-led coalition have damaged sewage plants, they've damaged hospitals, and that has also created the spread of this epidemic.
The conflict has killed more than 10,000 civilians, displaced millions, and pushed Yemen to the brink of famine.
Moscow's retaliation to US sanctions could far outweigh the Obama administration's expulsion of 35 Russians last year. That was part of the US response to so-called cyber interference by Moscow in the US election campaign, accusations Russia has repeatedly denied. Now Moscow has ordered the US to reduce its number of diplomats and staff to 455, a reduction of more than 700.
The majority of those numbers are what we call locally employed staff. They're Russians who work at the embassy. And so my guess is the bulk of the reductions are going to fall on Russians. The Russians are going to lose their jobs. It'll slow up some things. My guess is that it's going to become a longer waiting time to get a visa. But what I suspect the embassy is going to do is it'll identify important functions, those functions that are less important, and it will then allocate the reductions so that it can protect core functions and then shed some of the support activities.
When President Trump signs into law fresh sanctions against Russia, there will likely be further retaliatory measures by Moscow.
Two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed. Without further objection, the motion to reconsider.
Representatives from key Muslim nations have met in Turkey following weeks of controversy over Israeli actions at Jerusalem's Al-Aqsa Mosque. Tensions erupted after Israel installed metal detectors there following the shooting of 2 Israeli policemen. After international condemnation, Israel removed the detectors. Closing Al-Aqsa Mosque for worshippers is a violation against the feelings of Muslims all over the world. It's a horrible development which can make the situation in the occupied Palestinian territories more complicated. Turkey's foreign minister said Israel had taken a step toward common sense after reversing its decision. We hope that from now on Israel adopts an attitude that fully takes into consideration Muslim sensitivities surrounding Jerusalem and the holy sites. The Al-Aqsa Mosque is Islam's 3rd holiest shrine and also the holiest place in Judaism. Israel said the measures were needed for security, while Palestinians called them an effort to put the site under Israeli control. The removal of the metal detectors was welcomed by the Arab world, but disturbances quickly resumed when thousands of Muslim worshippers surged back into the mosque.
Turkey is holding its largest trial ever over the July 2016 coup attempt. Almost 500 people were escorted into court amid protesters' taunts, many of whom shouted, "We want the death penalty." The trial centres around the Akinci airbase, which the government alleges was the plotters' headquarters. Defendants will appear in a purpose-built courtroom outside the capital Ankara, facing a number of charges from attempting to assassinate the president to murder. Rebel soldiers tried to grab power in July 2016, leaving 249 civilians dead. In the aftermath, which was led by military officers, 40,000 people were arrested and 120,000 sacked or suspended. They included soldiers, police, teachers and public servants, all of whom were accused of having links with militant groups. And arrests have continued en masse ever since. To further cement his position, President Erdogan narrowly won a controversial referendum on increasing his powers earlier this year. It was a move that bitterly divided Turkey, with critics arguing it brings him closer to authoritarian rule.
Ito na din ang momento po ang espasyo komersyal. Oras na back e Deporte CBN. É programa com mais de uma década de informação. Número 1.